Picture this. You're standing on the bow of something that shouldn't exist. It's 1878. You're somewhere on the upper Mississippi, just south of La Crosse, Wisconsin. The morning fog hasn't burned off yet. The air smells like pine resin and river water, and the faint sulfur of a coal fire burning somewhere downstream. And beneath your feet is a raft of white pine logs that stretches back so far you can barely see the end of it. 3 football fields. That's how long this thing is. Over 1,000 feet of timber, lashed together, floating on the current like some impossible wooden island. You're looking at roughly 2 million board feet of lumber, enough wood to build 400 houses, enough to construct an entire town, worth somewhere north of $60,000 in 1878 money. Adjusted for today, you're standing on top of $3 million of cargo. And there are only 6 men responsible for getting it downstream. 6 men with long wooden oars. No engines, no steering wheels, no brakes. Just 6 men, 2,000 tons of timber, and 500 miles of river between here and the sawmills at St. Louis. If you hit a bridge piling, the whole raft could break apart in seconds. If fog rolls in thicker than this, you're navigating blind with a fortune in timber. If the wind picks up from the wrong direction, the current alone won't be enough to keep you in the channel. And if you go into the water out here, with logs shifting and chains groaning and the current pulling at your legs, your chances of coming out alive are not something anyone wants to calculate. One of those 6 men is a pilot named Stephen Hanks. He's been running rafts down the Mississippi since before the Civil War. He knows every sandbar, every snag, every treacherous bend between the pineries of Wisconsin and the mills down south. Right now, he's standing at the stern with a 22-foot sweep oar, watching the water ahead and reading the river like most men read a newspaper. His hands are calloused from decades of gripping that oar. His eyes are narrowed against the glare off the water. He hasn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in the past week. This is the story of the largest moving objects ever built on American rivers. This is the story of the men who guided them. And this is the story of an industry so dangerous, so demanding, and so utterly forgotten that most Americans have never heard of it. Let's start with the problem they were trying to solve. By 1850, the great forests of the upper Midwest contained more white pine than anyone could accurately measure. Wisconsin alone held an estimated 130 billion board feet of standing timber. Minnesota had nearly as much. Michigan's Upper Peninsula was blanketed with pine so dense that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. The lumber was there, an almost incomprehensible abundance of it, stretching across thousands of square miles of northern wilderness. And the demand was ravenous. Chicago was rebuilding constantly, swallowing lumber faster than the mills could produce it. St. Louis was expanding. The entire prairie frontier needed wood for houses, barns, fences, and railroad ties. Settlers pouring into Kansas and Nebraska and the Dakotas needed lumber to build the structures that would transform grassland into farmland. The market was essentially bottomless. But there was a problem that seemed almost impossible to solve. The timber was in the wrong place. The white pine forests covered the northern reaches of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. The markets were hundreds of miles to the south and west. And in the 1850s and 1860s, there were no railroads penetrating those northern forests. The trees might as well have been on the moon. You could cut them down easily enough. But how do you move a log that weighs 2,000 pounds across 100 miles of roadless wilderness? Wagon roads were useless for bulk transport. A single wagon could carry maybe 10 logs. To move 1 million board feet, you'd need thousands of wagon trips over roads that didn't exist. The cost would exceed the value of the lumber. Except for one thing: rivers. The Chippewa River flowed through the heart of Wisconsin's pine country. The St. Croix marked the border with Minnesota, and ran straight south toward the Mississippi. The Wisconsin River cut across the center of the state. The Black River, the Rum River, the Pine River, every major drainage in the North Woods eventually, inevitably, fed into the Mississippi. If you could get the logs onto the water would carry them south. The first solution was obvious. Cut the trees near the riverbanks, drag them to the water, roll them in, and let the current take them downstream. This was called a log drive. Thousands of individual logs floating loose in the river, pushed along by the current and by men with pike poles who waded into the freezing water to keep the timber moving. Log drives worked. For a few years, they were the only method available. But they had serious problems that became worse as the scale of logging increased. The logs jammed constantly. When the lead logs hit an obstacle, a boulder or a shallow stretch or a tight bend in the river, the logs behind them piled up. Within minutes, you could have 10,000 logs wedged together in a mass that blocked the entire river. These jams could grow to monstrous size. The worst documented jam on the Chippewa River in 1869 contained an estimated 200 million board feet of timber and stretched for 15 miles. Breaking a jam was among the most dangerous work in America. Men had to walk out onto the shifting logs, their caulked boots gripping the bark, their pike poles probing for the key logs that held the whole mass together. Find the right log, pry it loose, and the jam might break all at once. Men caught on the logs when a jam broke were often killed instantly. They were thrown into the churning water, struck by logs weighing a ton or more, dragged under by the current. Some were crushed between logs that ground together with the force of locomotives. In the spring of 1871, a jam broke on the Wolf River in Wisconsin. A crew of 14 men was working on the logs when the mass suddenly gave way. 11 of them made it to shore. 3 did not. Their bodies were found days later, miles downstream, battered beyond recognition. The Chippewa River alone killed dozens of men during the log drive era. The Menominee, the Peshtigo, the rivers of northern Michigan. Every major logging stream in the upper Midwest has its casualties, most of them unmarked, many of them never properly counted. And even when drives went smoothly, there was another problem: loss. Individual logs floating loose in a river had a tendency to disappear. They got waterlogged and sank. They washed up on sandbars and shores. They were stolen by farmers and settlers who figured that a free log was a free log, and who could prove otherwise? They got stranded in backwaters and sloughs, and stayed there until the wood rotted. By the time a drive reached the mills, anywhere from 10 to 20% of the timber had vanished. On a drive worth $100,000, that meant losing $10,000 to $20,000 somewhere along the way. The lumber companies needed a better solution. They needed a way to move vast quantities of timber downriver without the jams, without the losses, and without losing men every spring to the brutal work of breaking log jams. What they came up with was the lumber raft. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of floating logs loose in the river, you tied them together. A group of logs bound into a single unit couldn't jam against itself. It couldn't scatter across miles of riverbank. It couldn't sink one log at a time. If you lashed enough logs together, you created something more like a boat than a collection of floating debris. The basic unit was called a crib. A crib was a rectangular platform of logs, typically 16 feet wide and 32 feet long. Workers built these cribs right at the water's edge, near the logging camps, during the winter months when the ground was frozen and dragging logs was easier. They laid out the logs parallel to each other, trimmed the ends roughly even, then bound them together with cross pieces and chains. A finished crib contained somewhere between 12 and 20 logs, depending on their size. It floated low in the water. just a few inches of timber showing above the surface, solid enough that a man could walk across it without fear. One crib by itself wasn't impressive, maybe 400 board feet of lumber. But cribs could be joined together. Workers would float a crib out into the river and tie it to another crib, side by side. Then another. Then another. A row of cribs, lashed together with chains and rope, might stretch 40 or 50 feet across. Multiple rows, connected end to end with more chains and cable, could stretch hundreds of feet. And a complete lumber raft, built from dozens or even hundreds of cribs, could reach lengths that defied belief. The biggest rafts documented on the Mississippi exceeded 1,000 feet in length. 1,000 feet is longer than 3 football fields laid end to end. Some rafts were wider than they were deep, stretching 200 feet or more across the river, nearly blocking the entire navigable channel. The volume of timber in a single large raft could approach 3 million board feet. The weight might exceed 2,000 tons. Picture that for a moment. You're looking at a floating platform of logs, nearly a quarter-mile long and 200 feet wide. It contains enough lumber to build 600 houses. It weighs more than a fully loaded freight train. And it's moving down the river at roughly 4 miles per hour, steered by men with wooden oars. If you're wondering how anyone could possibly control something that massive, you're asking exactly the right question. The answer was a combination of skill, tools, cooperation, and sheer nerve. The primary steering mechanism was the sweep oar. A sweep was a long wooden oar, typically 20 to 25 feet in length, mounted on a pivot at the bow or stern of the raft. A man standing at the sweep could push it from side to side, and the blade dragging through the water would exert pressure on that end of the raft. Push the bow left, the bow goes left. Push the stern right, the stern swings right. In theory, it was similar to steering a canoe. In practice, it was like trying to steer a building. On a small raft, one man at each end might be enough. But on the massive rafts that became common after 1870, you needed multiple sweeps at each end, and multiple men at each sweep. A raft 1,000 feet long might have 4 or 5 sweeps at the bow, and 4 or 5 at the stern, each one manned by 2 or 3 men. Coordinating all those sweeps required constant communication and split-second timing. If the bow sweeps pushed one way while the stern sweeps pushed the other, the raft would do nothing but twist and groan. The men who operated the sweeps were called raftsmen. Strong men generally, experienced with boats and water, willing to work long hours for decent pay. But the man who commanded them was something else entirely. He was called a pilot. A Mississippi lumber raft pilot was among the most skilled workers in 19th century America. He had to know the river the way you know your own house in the dark. Every sandbar, and they shifted every season. Every rock ledge, and some were hidden just inches below the surface. Every submerged snag that could rip the bottom out of a crib. Every treacherous current where the water churned in ways that could spin a raft sideways. Every bridge, because bridges were where most of the worst accidents happened. The pilot stood at the stern, usually on an elevated platform that gave him a view over the entire length of the raft. From there, he could see the water ahead, read its surface for signs of trouble, and shout commands to the crews at the sweeps. His job was to keep the raft in the main channel, avoid obstacles, and navigate successfully through every hazard between the pineries and the mills. This was not something you could learn from a book. There were no charts detailed enough to be useful. There was no substitute for years of experience on the water. A pilot earned his position by spending years as a raftsman, watching the river, memorizing its moods, learning to read water the way a hunter reads tracks, or a farmer reads weather. George Winan started as a cook's assistant on a lumber raft in 1859. He was 15 years old, thin as a pole, desperate for any work that would keep him fed. By the time he was 30, he had worked every position on a raft. By 40, he was one of the most sought-after pilots on the upper Mississippi. He made the run from Stillwater to St. Louis over 90 times without losing a raft. John Buisson came from a family of French-Canadian loggers who had worked the Ottawa River before migrating west. He learned to read water before he learned to read books. On the morning of June 14, 1876, he brought a raft through the bridge at Quincy, Illinois, in fog so thick the bow crew couldn't see the stern. He did it by listening. He said later that he could hear where the pilings were by the way the water sounded against them. And then there was Stephen Hanks. Hanks was born in Kentucky in 1822. His family had some connection to Abraham Lincoln's family, distant cousins on his mother's side, though Hanks himself never made much of it. He came to the upper Mississippi as a young man in the early 1840s, looking for opportunity in a country that had precious little of it for men without capital or connections. He found work on a lumber raft almost by accident. Within a decade, he was one of the finest pilots on the river. The records of the Chippewa Lumber and Boom Company mention Hanks repeatedly. He is listed as pilot for dozens of rafts between 1856 and 1888. His pay was consistently higher than other pilots. On several occasions, the company specifically requested him for rafts carrying premium timber worth more than average. He made over 200 successful trips down the Mississippi. He knew the channel so well that he could navigate at night by the sound of the water against the banks. But even the best pilots couldn't eliminate the danger. They could only manage it. The Mississippi River below the mouth of the Wisconsin was navigable, but navigable didn't mean safe. Sandbars shifted constantly. Spring floods carved new channels and filled in old ones. Snags, the submerged remains of trees that had fallen into the river years or decades earlier, lurked beneath the surface, ready to tear logs loose from their cribs. And bridges posed the most concentrated danger of all. By 1870, the Mississippi was crossed by numerous railroad and wagon bridges. Each bridge had support pilings sunk into the riverbed. The gaps between pilings were called draws, and the draws were often barely wide enough to accommodate a raft. A raft 200 feet wide, passing through a draw 300 feet wide, had only 50 feet of clearance on each side. And the raft was moving with the current, which meant it couldn't stop. There was no reverse gear. There was no brake. Once you committed to a bridge approach, you were going through no matter what. Hitting a piling was catastrophic. The impact could shear the lashing chains that held cribs together. Cribs would break free and scatter. Logs would spill into the river. Within seconds, a tightly organized raft worth $60,000 could become a chaotic mass of loose timber worth a fraction of that amount. And any man who fell into the water amid breaking logs and snapping chains was unlikely to survive. Drowning was the most common cause of death among raftsmen, but it wasn't the only one. The chains and cables used to lash cribs together were under enormous tension. Thousands of pounds of force holding logs in alignment. If a cable snapped, it whipped through the air with enough force to cut a man in half. Men were struck by flying chains and thrown into the river, their bodies broken before they even hit the water. Others were crushed between logs when a crib broke apart. Still others were pulled under when their clothing snagged on submerged debris. I've spent considerable time trying to locate reliable mortality statistics for raft workers on the upper Mississippi. The numbers are frustratingly incomplete. Most deaths weren't recorded in any central registry. There was no federal agency tracking workplace fatalities. Local newspapers occasionally reported drownings, but only when the victim was well known or the circumstances were particularly dramatic. What survives in the records are fragments. A Dubuque newspaper from June 1874 reports that a raftsman named Peter Olson, age 22, was killed when a cable parted near the Savannah Bridge. He was from Eau Claire originally. He left behind a wife named Ingrid and an infant daughter he had seen only once. A company ledger from the Knapp, Stout and Company lumber concern mentions that 3 men were lost in April 1879 when a raft broke up in rapids above Winona. Their names were not recorded, only the notation that 3 crewmen were missing and presumed drowned. A letter from a Wisconsin farmer, preserved in a historical society collection, describes watching a raft hit the bridge at Prairie du Chien in 1881. The writer states that he saw at least 2 men go into the water and did not see them come up. He walked the riverbank for an hour looking for survivors. He found none. These are glimpses, just glimpses. The full toll will never be known. But every spring, when the rafting season began, families in river towns like Eau Claire and Stillwater and Winona said goodbye to fathers and sons and brothers, knowing that some would not return. What we do know is that the men accepted these risks because the pay was good and because the work, however dangerous, was seasonal. A man could work the rafts from April through October and earn enough to carry his family through the winter. For young men with few skills and fewer prospects, the lumber industry offered something close to opportunity in an era when opportunity was scarce. But let me tell you what a full trip looked like. Not the statistics, the experience. A raft assembled on the Chippewa River near Eau Claire in April might not reach St. Louis until late May or early June. The journey covered somewhere between 500 and 700 miles, depending on the exact route. Average speed was around 4 miles per hour when the current was favorable, but that was just time actually moving. Rafts had to stop for fog. They had to stop for headwinds that could actually push them backward. They had to stop for repairs when logs worked loose and needed to be relashed. And they had to time their approach to bridges carefully, sometimes waiting hours for conditions to be just right. A single trip might take 4 to 6 weeks. During that time, the crew lived on the raft. Toward the stern, there was usually a small wooden shack called a cook shanty where meals were prepared. The cook was one of the essential crew members. He kept a fire burning in an iron stove, boiled coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, and produced meals that were filling, if not elegant. The men ate beans, salt pork, bread when it lasted, hardtack when it didn't, and coffee at every opportunity. The food kept them going. Nobody expected it to be good. They slept in shifts because someone always had to be watching the river. On warm nights, they slept on the logs themselves, wrapping themselves in blankets and listening to the water gurgle beneath them. On cold nights, they crowded into the cook shanty or huddled around fires built in iron kettles set on beds of sand to keep from burning through the logs. The fires threw flickering light across the surface of the raft, and beyond the light was nothing but darkness and the sound of water. There was no privacy. There was no shelter from rain except the cook shanty, which couldn't hold the whole crew at once. When storms came through, the men just got wet and stayed wet until the sun came out. When temperatures dropped, they added layers and kept moving to stay warm. When mosquitoes swarmed up from the riverbanks at dusk, thick enough to darken the air, the men smeared themselves with bacon grease or simply endured. And through all of it, they worked. A raft in motion required constant attention. Men walked the length of the raft, checking lashings, tightening chains, looking for logs that had worked loose. Others manned the sweeps, ready to respond the instant the pilot called out a command. The commands came in a vocabulary developed over decades on the river. Hard over, easy up, check her down. Each phrase meant something specific, and the men at the sweeps had to translate words into muscle and movement without hesitation. At night, when the raft was tied up along the shore, crews often worked by lantern light making repairs. A loose crib that seemed minor in daylight could become a catastrophe in the dark. Better to fix it now, even if it meant losing sleep. The pilots were responsible for every decision: where to run, when to stop, whether to attempt a bridge passage or wait for better conditions. A good pilot didn't just know the river, he knew his crew. He knew which men could be trusted at the critical sweeps, and which were better kept to lighter duties. He knew when the crew was too tired to respond properly, and needed rest even if conditions seemed favorable. He carried the weight of every life on that raft, and the weight of the cargo too, and the knowledge that a single bad decision could destroy both. Stephen Hanks carried that weight for nearly 50 years, 200 trips, millions of board feet delivered safely, thousands of decisions that turned out right. The companies trusted him because he didn't make mistakes, but nobody could eliminate risk entirely. The river was too powerful, the rafts were too massive, the margin for error was too thin. And then came the steamboats. By the early 1870s, lumber companies began experimenting with a new approach to raft navigation. Instead of relying entirely on the current and human-powered sweeps, they attached steamboats to their rafts and used engine power to move downstream. The advantages were obvious. A steamboat could move a raft faster than the current alone, shaving days or even weeks off the journey time. A steamboat could also provide power for steering, making it easier to maneuver through tight spots. Companies calculated that the savings in time and labor would more than offset the cost of the steam power. They were right about the time savings, but they underestimated the new dangers. A steamboat pushing a raft from behind had far less control than a steamboat towing a raft. But pushing was impractical for rafts the size being assembled in the 1870s and 1880s. The solution was to attach the steamboat to the bow and have it pull the raft downstream. This created a different problem. A steamboat pulling a 1,000-foot raft had terrible maneuverability. The sheer mass of the raft behind it resisted any attempt to change direction. Starting a turn required the steamboat to pull at an angle, while the sweeps at the stern fought to bring the back end around. But the raft wanted to continue straight ahead. Completing a turn meant overcoming the momentum of 2,000 tons of timber. In a narrow channel with a sharp bend, this could be nearly impossible. The first documented disaster involving a steamboat-towed raft occurred near Quincy, Illinois in May 1874. The steamboat John Nelson was towing a raft of approximately 800 feet when the pilot attempted to navigate a bend in the channel. The raft swung wide, struck a submerged sandbar, and broke apart. Over half the timber was lost, scattered across 3 miles of river. The steamboat itself was nearly capsized when the tow cables snapped and recoiled with killing force. Remarkably, no one died in that accident. But it demonstrated that steam power created new risks, even as it solved old problems. Over the following 2 decades, the industry developed better techniques. Steamboat captains learned to work more closely with raft pilots. Communication systems improved. Better cables and better methods of attachment reduced the danger of catastrophic failures. Crews stationed at key points along the raft could respond more quickly to commands relayed from the steamboat. The worst of the early problems were solved through experience, and the death of men who provided that experience at the cost of their lives. But the steamboats also signaled something else. They signaled the beginning of the end. If steam power could move rafts down the river faster and more reliably, it could also move logs over land. And by the 1880s, the railroad network was expanding rapidly into the northern forests that had once seemed so inaccessible. The first rail lines into Wisconsin's pine country reached Eau Claire in 1870, and Chippewa Falls shortly after. By 1880, multiple rail lines penetrated the heart of the timber region. Spur lines reached the logging camps themselves, and railroads could do something rivers never could. They could move lumber year-round, not just during the rafting season when the rivers were high and flowing. They could move lumber directly to markets in Chicago and Milwaukee and points east, without the transshipment at St. Louis. and they could move lumber reliably, without the risks of sandbars, bridge pilings, fog, and sudden storms. The economics shifted almost overnight. In 1880, river rafting still dominated the movement of lumber from the upper Midwest. The Great Rafts were the primary arteries of the timber trade. By 1890, railroads had captured the majority of the traffic. By 1900, rafting had declined to a small fraction of its former scale. The men who had spent their lives mastering the river found themselves without work. The last great lumber raft went down the Mississippi on August 27, 1915. It was assembled at Stillwater, Minnesota, on the St. Croix River. The raft measured approximately 270 feet wide and 1,550 feet long, nearly a third of a mile. It contained roughly 2.5 million board feet of timber. A steamboat named the Ottumwa Belle towed it downriver to Rock Island, Illinois, where the logs were delivered to a sawmill. A photographer captured images of that final raft. The photographs show a vast floating platform stretching to the horizon, dwarfing the steamboat attached to its bow. On the raft itself, you can see a few tiny figures, the last raftsmen, going about their work. They look impossibly small against the scale of the timber. They probably knew it was the end. When the Ottumwa Belle completed its delivery at Rock Island, an era ended. There would be no more great rafts on the Mississippi. The skills that Stephen Hanks and George Winans and John Buisson and hundreds of other pilots had spent their lives mastering were suddenly obsolete. Men who could read water, who could navigate by starlight, who could feel the river's mood in the tremor of a sweep oar, had no place in a world of railroad cars and steel bridges. Most of them simply vanished from the historical record. The pilots and raftsmen had never been wealthy. They had earned good wages for dangerous seasonal work, but they had saved little. Most had families depending on them. When the work disappeared, they had to find something else. Some drifted into other occupations. Some found work on the expanding railroad network, the very industry that had destroyed their livelihood. Others moved west, chasing opportunities in Montana or Oregon, or wherever the frontier still offered chances to men willing to work hard. A few opened small businesses in the river towns where they had once tied up their rafts, taverns mostly, or general stores. But most left nothing behind. No memoirs, no photographs, no gravestones marked with their occupations. The men who built and navigated the largest moving objects ever seen on American rivers passed from living memory within a single generation. I have tried to find physical remnants of this industry. It isn't easy. In Stillwater, Minnesota, there's a small museum with a few artifacts from the lumber era. Some tools, some photographs, a section of chain that might have been used to lash cribs together. The exhibits tell the story competently, but they can't convey the scale. You can't look at a photograph and understand what it felt like to stand on something 1,000 feet long and feel it respond to your steering. In Winona, Minnesota, there's a commemorative plaque near the riverbank. It notes that Winona was once a major hub for the lumber trade. The plaque is weathered now, and the words are hard to read. It does not name any of the men who worked there. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, I found what might be the most honest memorial. It's a stretch of riverbank where nothing has been built, just trees and water, and the faint outlines of what might once have been a landing area. No plaque, no sign, just the river, still flowing toward St. Louis, still capable of carrying a raft if anyone cared to build one. I stood there for a long time. The Mississippi flows through the heart of America. Every day, barges carry grain and coal and petroleum products up and down its length. The modern barge industry moves more tonnage than the lumber rafts ever did. But the barges are pushed by powerful diesel towboats with radar and GPS and crews in constant radio contact with shore stations. The danger hasn't been eliminated, but it's been reduced by technology to something manageable, something insurable. Nobody navigates by reading the water anymore. Nobody earns their position by spending years watching the river learning its moods, memorizing its sandbars. The kind of skill that Stephen Hanks possessed, the ability to feel the current through a wooden sweep and know instinctively where the channel lay, has no value in a world of electronic navigation. We gained efficiency. We gained safety. We gained the ability to move vast quantities of material without risking lives on every trip. But we lost something too. We lost the direct connection between human skill and human accomplishment. When Hanks brought a raft through the bridge at Dubuque, he knew that his judgment and his hands had made it possible. The current and the timber were just materials. The shaping force was human. When a modern towboat captain pushes barges through the same spot, he's relying on equipment designed by engineers he'll never meet and systems maintained by technicians in distant cities. The satisfaction of mastery has been replaced by the satisfaction of operating systems. I'm not saying the old way was better. I couldn't say that even if I wanted to. Too many men died. Too many families received word that a father or brother or son had been lost in the river.
Peter Olson's daughter grew up without a father because a cable snapped. 3 unnamed men on a Knapp stout raft left behind families who never recovered their bodies. The lumber raft era was brutal, and the men who survived it were marked by it. But they were also part of something larger than themselves. They were transforming a continent. The lumber they moved downstream built cities. It built farms. It built the railroad lines that would eventually make their own work obsolete. Every board foot that reached the mills at St. Louis became part of America's expansion, part of the physical infrastructure that made the modern nation possible. The houses we live in now have ancestors in that timber. The framing, the joists, the rafters. Somewhere back in the supply chain, those boards traveled down a river on a raft. The raftsmen didn't see it that way, of course. They saw wages and working conditions and the chance to earn enough to get through another year. They didn't think of themselves as building a country. They thought of themselves as getting by. But that's almost always how it works. The people who do the hardest work rarely understand its significance while they're doing it. They're too tired, too focused on the immediate task, too worried about surviving to the end of the season. The perspective that allows us to see their contribution comes later, when historians piece together the fragments and economists calculate the impact, and filmmakers produce documentaries for audiences who will never hold a sweep oar. By then, the workers are gone. Their names are lost. Their faces are forgotten. Their skills, which took years to develop and which represented genuine mastery of a difficult craft, have no heirs. The raft pilots of the Upper Mississippi built rafts longer than any wooden structures in history. They navigated hazards that would terrify modern operators. They moved more timber down that river than had ever been moved by any method anywhere in the world. And almost nobody remembers them. The next time you see the Mississippi, whether from a bridge or a riverbank or an airplane window, try to imagine it as it looked in 1878. Picture a raft stretching back into the distance, a floating platform of logs that seems to have no end. Picture 6 men scattered across its length, each at his station, each ready to respond when the pilot calls out a command. Picture Stephen Hanks at the stern, his hands on a sweep oar, his eyes on the water. He's watching for the signs that tell him where the channel is deepest, where the current runs cleanest, where the hidden sandbars wait to trap the unwary. He's reading a language written in ripples and eddies, and the color of the water against the light. He's doing something that no one alive can do anymore. And when he brings that raft safely to St. Louis, when the logs are finally delivered to the sawmill, and the crew is paid, and the whole operation is over, nobody will write it down. Nobody will record his name in a history book. Nobody will commission a statue, or establish an award, or name a building after him. He'll just collect his wages, walk into town for a meal and a drink,
and then go back upriver to do it again. 200 trips, 5 decades on the water, millions of board feet delivered successfully. And when he died, probably in some small river town, probably attended only by family, and maybe a few old colleagues who remembered the days when rafting still mattered, the Mississippi just kept flowing. The timber industry moved on. The sawmills moved on. America moved on. The river kept the only memorial that mattered. The river that carried the rafts and swallowed the men who fell from them, and still runs south today, the same as it did when the first cribs went into the water. That's the memorial. The river itself. Everything else is just stories we tell each other to remember what we've already lost.